Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started now that Berkeley time has rung. It's great. It has, yes. It's great to see you all here for this event on diasporism and Jewish politics. I will be moderating a conversation between two illustrious scholars of the topic, Ethan Katz and Ilan Stavans. Professor Stavans is visiting us today from the East Coast and will be presenting this evening at the Magnus Museum a new project, a new book, Sabor Judío, which is a collaboration with Professor Margaret Boyle. They will both be at the Magnus at 5 p.m. So I don't know if there's still tickets available, but I hope there are. I hope you all will join us, and also there'll be some opportunities to eat delicious, sabrosa comida judía mexicana. So it's a pleasure to be on at the table with these two. Let me give you a little bit of introduction. Professor Ethan Katz, who is associate professor in the history department and chair of the Center for Jewish Studies, along with other really important administrative and intellectual roles on campus. He's the author of the monograph, The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, which came out in 2015. He's co-edited several volumes. One of them is Jews and Colonialism. Another is Secularism in Question, Jews and Judaism in Modern Times. And more recently, When Jews Argue, Between the University and the Beit Midrash, which came out just maybe a year ago. And he has a forthcoming book, very timely topic, The Zionist Paradox, Jews, Colonialism, and the Case for History. And that's just a sort of thumbnail of who Ethan is as a scholar. Let me also introduce Professor Stavans to you. This will be a somewhat longer introduction because of
he's older.
That's right.
And he was his teacher, too.
Yes. Okay. Definitely, Ilan, you have one of the most capacious and expansive intellectual careers I have seen in a really long time. Professor Stavans is Louis Sebring Professor in Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College. All of us at this table are connected in one way or another to Amherst. He's held visiting appointments at universities around the world. He's a renowned scholar of Latin American and Latino art and literature. He is a publisher. He's the founder and owner of Restless Books. He's also an art curator. He's the editor of several hugely important series and projects, including the University of New Mexico's Jewish Latin America series, which has done so much to put Jewish Latin America on the radar of English-speaking audiences. Also, the Norton Anthology of Latino Literature. These are just two of these big projects. And Ilan has also translated some of the most important Latin American poetry and fiction into English. So again, the theme of bringing this body of work to a larger audience. He is himself a writer of fiction. He's published story collections and memoirs about growing up Mexican and Jewish. One of his stories was made into a movie. The title in English is My Mexican Shiva. I highly recommend it. It's a really funny, ironic, and very perceptive film. Ilan has also created graphic novels and fotonovelas. He's participated in numerous conversaciones, conversations, a special kind of literary scholarly genre. And he has an incredible body of collaborative work with photographers, comic book artists, other writers, scholars. Ilan's publications have won many prizes. Some have put him on the New York Times bestseller list. And his pieces have appeared in so many newspapers around the world: the New York Times, the New Yorker, The Nation, Tikkun, the Jewish Quarterly, Jewish Frontier, many other publications in the United States or in English, and also in Spanish, in El País, La Jornada, Excelsior, El Universal, and many other Spanish language newspapers and journals. Ilan has become an important voice for the promotion and study of Yiddish in the US and Latin America, and also a promoter of Spanglish, of multilingualism and of keeping your local accent instead of adopting the bland and blended voices of media speak. And perhaps more than any other living scholar, he is a translator and mediator between overlapping, yet at times mutually ignorant worlds of Latino America, Anglo America, Latin America, and the Jewish Americas. So, I feel like my mic just cut off. Did it? Can you hear me now? Yes, okay. So, without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to both of our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we are going to be talking today about diasporism and Jewish politics. And so I wanted to start with a really basic question for both of you, Ethan and Ilan. What is diasporism? How do you define it?
Well, first, I just want to thank Estelle and thank very much my old teacher, Professor Stavans, Ilan, for being here. It's a real pleasure and an honor. And hopefully I perform better here than I did sometimes in your class, as we spoke about before, that you were charitable in your memory. Thanks to Amherst College for all three of us being here. So, I mean, there are multiple definitions of diasporism. And, I would say there are maybe three quickly they're operative for our current conversations. One is sort of a very kind of broad, almost ethos of emphasizing the diaspora experience as fundamental to what it means to be Jewish in the post-destruction period. For the last 2,000 years, a notion that experiences of persecution and exile really shape what it means to be Jewish in a meaningful sense, that the writings produced at the beginning of the first millennium post-destruction, the Talmud, are a fundamental part of that outlook, and that's supposed to shape also Jewish politics. A second meaning, which I think in some ways is the most neglected, but maybe still the most important, is a more precise historical one, which is diaspora nationalism, particularly as shaped by Shimon Dubnov, the famous historian and sort of the father of diaspora nationalism. And that's really a program that was a political and cultural program that had very material aspects to it as well, that was part of the competing landscape of Jewish nationalisms in the late 19th and early 20th century. Other forms also connected to Bundism, but I would argue that the Dubnovian was the most robust and the most important. And then the third is, to my mind, sort of the most vague, but maybe the most widely spoken about today, which is sort of like some kind of cosmopolitan, pluralistic, hybrid notion of what it means to be Jewish and to de-emphasize attachment to Israel or Zionism.
Estelle, thank you very much for being here and for moderating. And I do remember you very fondly in that class. Ethan, I am extraordinarily proud to be sharing the table with you, and would add just a little twist to the three definitions that you offer. For me, diasporism, a term that has acquired renewed meaning and relevance after October 7, but that has been with us for quite some time meaning not only 2,000 years, but maybe even 3,000 years, depending on how far one goes, but these are just numbers that one throws into the bucket, is the experience of being a minority as a minority in the context of a large civil engagement that the Enlightenment, the Jewish Enlightenment in particular, the Haskalah, repositioned by saying Jews no longer live in a ghetto, Jews or in a juderia or wherever that isolated place is, and are now in society, full-fledged, and we as a society have a responsibility for them just as much as they have a responsibility to being full-fledged members. And I would add, because I think there's going to be a number of reverberations of this, that in the context of America in the second Trump season, the health of minorities is probably the best thermometer to understand how the society is doing as a whole. And from the moment of the Haskalah to the present, the difficult health, you were talking about the violence, the anti-Semitism, the withstanding of the attacks that come from behind that shape who Jews are as characters. But that if we go to the Spanish coexistence, and if we go to the Roman period, and if we go to the Greek period, are also featured in a variety of ways. Simply stated, it is the capacity to understand that in contemporary times, diasporism is a statement of health of a small group that projects the overall health of the society at large and vice versa.
Ethan, did you want to follow up to that, or?
Only to say, I think there's a strong overlap between, especially the first kind of general meaning that I discussed and what you just said about the consciousness, sort of a kind of minority consciousness. I think a question, and it'll be interesting to see, we may have some different outlooks on it. I think a question that's important is how fundamental is a kind of robust Jewishness, Jewish knowledge, Jewish education, some sense of tradition to what diasporism means. Because there I think there's some strong divergences and some notions of diasporism that have older, deeper roots are really reliant upon a deep sense of some robust Jewishness that can be created in diasporic settings that has certain kinds of either community institutions or intellectual heft behind it. And there's other notions that I think are quite a bit more surface, frankly, where it's sort of functioning as a kind of critical mechanism vis-a-vis Zionism or vis-a-vis the Jewish establishment. But I'm not sure, I think we could discuss how Jewish it actually is or whether it has much staying power.
Maybe, Estelle, just to add one more element and throwing it back to you.
Sure.
If I can steal from some of those other realms that you were talking about, particularly the Latino or Latin American realm, and a term that came about in the late 80s and 90s, which was, and some of us, I was part of that kind of intellectual trend, life in and on the hyphen, meaning that if you are Cuban American, you are neither only Cuban nor only American, but you live in the hyphen in between, which is where you find the most comfort and the best expression that you are. Bringing it to the concept of diasporism, which is the question of German Jewish, American Jewish, Mexican Jewish, even Israeli Jewish, because diasporism can expand into Israel itself. And that connects with the question of belonging to the land, having an anthem, having a flag, having a central government that represents or doesn't represent you, and the duality of going back and forth, as it did in that hyphenated view of what the 90s were proposing for the Latino community and for other communities, that you could be at home and be more Cuban, and then you would be at school or at work and be more American, but that the traveling, the highway in between the two was that hyphen. I think that diasporism, understood through these many different rubrics, is the capacity to be twice in the same place in only one body.
So I hope we'll have time for me to come back to the question of diasporism and its relation to minority cultures, because I'm interested in thinking about other minority communities that have adopted diasporic paradigms, diasporic intellectual traditions. In the US, when one speaks of diaspora, one isn't only or necessarily thinking about Jewish communities, but let's come to that later, because I want to delve more into this current moment. And Ilan, you already opened the door to that. So tell us more about why you want to be delving into diasporism right now.
Yeah, I am like millions of other Jews in a state of absolute crisis, internal and external. The tenets that I have held dear in my past for 64 years now seem shaky and or at the very least acquire different colors. Maybe let me give you as a very brief biographical snippet here to place myself in a context. I am a Mexican Jew who is the grandchild of Yiddish-speaking, mostly shtetl, but also big city dwellers who arrived to Mexico in between 1915 and 1925, one of them probably a little bit later, with an agenda that was originally to arrive to the United States, but immigration quotas were made it impossible. And so the temporary locations were Cuba and Guatemala and Mexico. And for some of them, the temporary became constant. And for others, there was a move north. There was also part of the family that immigrated in the opposite geographical direction to Palestine, and it was instrumental in the forming of the army and of the early, in the second Aliyah, in the different governments, and in the revival of Hebrew. I am the grandchild, thus, of not Bundists, which was a particular ideology of Yiddish, but Yiddishists, secular, poor men and women, mostly from the countryside, shtetl dwellers, who believed that the continuity of the culture they had had for generations, and I am not able to go too far in terms of tracing the genealogical tree for research purposes, for reasons that have to do with archives and the destruction of a collective memory, believed that it was through Yiddish that they could continue being Jewish. There wasn't a religious component, and there wasn't also a component that had to do with an authentic, genuine, and above all, essentialist love for Mexico. Mexico really happened to be an accident in my grandparents' journey to the New World. It could have ended up being Argentina or Brazil, which were the bigger targets of immigration at that time. So I went to Yiddish schools. I went to the Yiddish Schule, the Alte Yiddish Schule in Mexico, and Yiddish was the language that served for us as a kind of overall protection and distinguishing characteristic of who we were. There were some Mexican Jews that were Zionists, and we were constantly hearing about them going to the United States, but to Israel, but it was really creating a yishuv in Mexico where Yiddish would make us different from the German immigrants that had arrived or the refugees from the Spanish Civil War. Mexico has an incredible reputation of opening its doors to all kinds of refugees from different parts. At one point, and I can say this with astonishing precision, there is a moment in which the old letters and lettercasts, teachers, male and female, in the Yiddish schools start dying or start retiring. I can't quite fully figure this out, Estelle, but I don't know if they didn't prepare a school where the new generation would be trained that would replace them with younger people, or they got tired of Yiddish, which is possible, but they were quickly, in the middle of my education, replaced by shlichim that were coming from Israel that now turned those classes of Yiddish into Hebrew language classes. And with it came the ideology of going to Israel, making Aliyah, and it permeated every aspect of our life, this new repositioning of how the Mexican Jewish community had to perceive itself vis-a-vis Israel. I was very resentful when I was young toward Yiddish. I thought that my parents were doing a disservice to me in teaching me a language that was all but dead and had no future. And it was a little bit like German, so I could learn a little German better. But the language to learn was English or French, but not Yiddish. And still there was some kind of obsession with Yiddish. Yiddish, I was taught, didn't have a government, didn't have a flag, didn't have an address. That was constantly being repeated. Yiddish did not have an address, did not have a homeland, even though Stalin at one point had offered Birobidzhan as an option for a place where the Jews could live in the Soviet Union with Yiddish. And so there was this radicalization of what the education was about. I first, I think, came across the concept of diaspora and diasporism in the Yiddish Schule, in the sense that we saw ourselves as another part of that chain of diasporas. At some point, we would probably be expelled from Mexico the way others had been expelled before. It's the fate, it is written in our DNA, and we would need to go, whoever was the survivor, that was the Darwinist approach that we would get, to the next iteration of the diaspora, where we would reinvent ourselves anew, just as this iteration had been invented, or almost invented, by the immigrants. But it wasn't fully invented because there had been Sephardic Jews that had arrived during the colonial period and conversos that had had a double life during that period. So Mexico had Jews before the Ashkenazi Jews arrived. It brings me back quickly to the present, and that is that in October 7, way before October 7, but October 7 becomes, in the aftermath of October 7, a reawakening of certain Yiddish and Yiddishist aspects of my personal education of what it means to be a diaspora Jew in Mexico and a diaspora Jew. Now I became an immigrant, like my grandparents had been immigrants to Mexico. I moved to the United States. I wasn't expelled, it was by choice. And I'll finish with this, Ethan. I remember when my two boys, I have 2, 34 and 29, were little. And I, as every parent, tried to figure out which shul, which Hebrew school, which non-Hebrew school to send them, etc. And I remember thinking, oof, if I could just give a little dose of the anti-Semitism that I had as a little boy to them in Mexico, they would really get a taste of what being Jewish is. Because here, they get a taste of being absolutely like everybody else. The Jews in America are at the center of culture. That's what I conceived at that time. Whereas the Jews in Mexico were never at the center of culture. We were always peripheral to culture. And to me, moving to the United States was in part a desire to be at the center of things. So it's a twisted idea to want your kids to feel the dirty, tragic taste of anti-Semitism, but it was in my mind a dose of reality.
Thank you for sharing that, Ilan. So, I mean, I will, I'll say a little bit that's sort of my own journey, but talk more about the post 10/7 moment from my perspective. So I think that since October 7th, there has been, for many people, a kind of shattering of, I mean, there's a lot we can say, but I want to focus on two elements that I think were essential to the diaspora-Israel, diaspora-Zionism relationship for a long period of time. And the first is perhaps the most obvious, which is the sort of general assumption that Israel was important for Jewish safety because it was a kind of guarantor of Jewish safety that couldn't exist absent Jewish sovereignty. I think, the shock, the in part sheer incompetence that led to October 7th from the Israeli perspective, the horror of that day. There were conspiracy theories at the outset because people found it so implausible that the Israeli government and military could have allowed this to happen. It was absolutely shattering for assumptions about Jewish safety. And some of what I'm going to say next is in part actually, I think, the perverse result of that, because to the degree that one can understand many of Israel's choices, particularly in the first several months of the war, as rational, and I think in many cases you can, it was about restoring Jewish deterrence in the face of the shattering of the kind of myth of relative invincibility, which led to by far the most violent and brutal war that Israel has ever waged. So that partly leads me to the second thing that I think really has been shattered since October 7th, and that is the sense that I think many of us who in some way consider ourselves to be liberal Zionists have always assumed, which is that Zionism is inflected by and shaped by, in crucial ways, a sort of diasporic consciousness, right? Which, to go back to the first definition of diasporism that I gave, some consciousness of long-standing experience of persecution that didn't just lead to a nationalism that was about safety for Jews, but that led to a nationalism that, for all of its flaws and for all of its internal debates, had significant strands that were invested in coexistence and fundamental ideas about human rights and notions connected to tikkun olam, experiences of Jews as what we often call the stranger. And I think that for many people who find themselves increasingly alienated from not only the war itself, but sort of the face of Israel that the war and this government have come to represent, and the choices that have been made in the course of the last 2 years, for many people, it's the sense that this is a Zionism that doesn't speak to what they thought Zionism was at all. There's a moment and a text that I find helpful for thinking about this tension, which is very famous sort of anthem, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. So for people who know the story of that song, right, that song was written originally in May of 1967 in response to a competition held by the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek. And it's a song, it's written by Naomi Shemer, and the song, as in its original version, is really, in many ways, a fairly melancholy song. It's largely about the parts of Jerusalem that no Jew can go to, that no Jew's been able to go to since 1948. It talks about a wall that sits in the center of the city. It's talking about the Kotel. It says we don't go on the Jericho Road anymore. And it's not just a sense of longing connected to the previous 19 years, but to the previous 2,000 years and lack of Jewish sovereignty over holy sites. Well, of course, in June of 1967, the Middle East is transformed by the Six-Day War, and Israel very unexpectedly reconquers, in the Zionist understanding, East Jerusalem. And there's another verse added to the song, right? The verse is about how now we can go to those places that we couldn't go to before. Now we return to the Jericho Road. Now the ram's horn is heard on the Kotel. The original verse talked about how it wasn't. And I teach the song sometimes, and I always insist on the students have to hear all the verses. Some versions of the song replace the original first verse from before the war, because it tells us a deep story about the arc of Jewish connection to Israel, relationship to sovereignty, and it has implicitly a story about how longing and suffering and loss and exile are embedded in the story of Jewish sovereignty and ultimate success in the land of Israel. And it's very, to me, and I think for many of us deeply attached to Israel, that connection is vital and crucial. And there's lots of ways to frame the current moment in the sense of crisis that you spoke to. But I think part of the sense of crisis is a real sense that diasporic consciousness of being a people who, whatever the flaws of Zionism, whatever the successes of and securities of Jewish sovereignty, that we're not supposed to forget, quote, where we came from as a people who were historically persecuted and fled from one place to another. And so many of us have that embedded in our family histories, as you described. And I think to watch the military campaign in its current phase, particularly, people have different views, and I respect them all. But from the standpoint of many of us, even who want to be charitable, I think there's a sense of a sort of profound loss of that consciousness in what Israel looks like right now.
That's really interesting because it's almost as if one of the questions would be how does one handle loss? Which of these two isms, maybe I'm gonna turn them into mutually opposing categories for 1 second, which is which of these two isms, diasporism or Zionism, does the best job of handling those feelings of loss, and the best job being the one that leads us to a better world, But let's maybe step back also from that sense of antagonism, because I think maybe one thing that's happening in this moment is that diasporism and Zionism are looking like very mutually opposing forces, even though, as you're saying, Ethan, in fact, the relationship between them is more complicated. Zionism is a pretty young ideology. Diasporism seems to be a very old one. So maybe Ilan, talk a little bit more about the relationship between diasporism and Zionism and how we hold them together, why it might be important to sort of disentangle, rethink the relationship between them.
Yeah, wonderful. I don't know if I disagree with you, Ethan, and I'll find out. We Jews used to think that we had a monopoly on victimhood. We made a life out of being victims. And we were victims. It's not as if it was a fiction, but we turned the suffering into some kind of expiation that led to great works of art, great works of science, whatever. It was that pathos or ethos of the suffering. We can no longer claim, in my view, any connection to the suffering that we had in 39 to 45. To me, with 3/4 of my family having perished during the Holocaust, I can't think of the Holocaust the same way now anymore. Even the thinking of the Holocaust has been redated, repositioned. Because now the Jews have power. Because now we are inflicting on others what others inflicted on us before. And the claim of expiation in beatitude is very difficult to hold. One of the great moments immediately after October 7 that passed by too quickly was the moment of hesitation of how Israel is going to react to this. Can we forgive? Can we create some kind of peaceful resolution to all this without a revenge? There are two intrinsic flaws in the ideology of Zionism. One is the conviction that the people who were living in the land were not people. They didn't have an authentic and legitimate a claim for that land. And whatever we could do to erase that claim, to silence that claim, would only advance the purpose of the creation and the empowerment of the state. The second unavoidable, fatal flaw is the conviction, and that's where I don't know, Ethan, if we are walking together or we are diverging here, is the conviction that the arrival of Israel represents the end of the diaspora. Because if we have a land now, and this is what Netanyahu and others have been saying, if we have a land now, why not be in the land? Why not claim your passport? Why not become a full-fledged member? And with the law of return, you don't have to wait. You do it automatically. But this is not the first time in history where there has been concurrently a Jewish state and a diaspora living together. With the destruction of the first temple in the year 580 before the Common Era by the Babylonians, there were people that were exiled from Israel and went to live in the Babylonian Empire. And there were people who stayed in what is today Palestine. And between 580 and the year 70 with the rebuilding and then the destruction of the Second Temple, there is something that we have similar to today, that is the coexistence of a Jewish homeland and the choice of some not to live in the homeland, to live outside. This also happens to be the moment in which, though the production of the Talmud takes a long time, there are two concurrent Talmuds, the Palestinian Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. They agree on many things, but they are byproducts of different mentalities, the mentality of living outside and the mentality of living inside. And with that comes the idea, I lived it when I was in Mexico, that if you have some trouble with another Jew, you don't go to the Mexican court. You go to the people's court, to the Jewish court. That's the first solution. And if it can stay there, why agitate anything? We don't need anybody else to tell us what the law is. We have our own law. And that was ingrained in every generation in Mexico of the parallel legal systems that minorities, not every minority as we were saying, but certainly the Jewish minority, seasoned as it is over 2,000 years, of how are you going to do in terms of security when you don't want to go to the Spanish government to defend you, since they are likely not going to defend you, or the Argentine government, etc. Which brings me to the second point, Ethan. Thanks to Hannah Arendt, who herself was a diasporist, we only think of Eichmann in Jerusalem, that incredible book that she wrote. But there is an Eichmann in Buenos Aires before Eichmann lives the last years in Jerusalem. And that is the Eichmann that changed his name, Ricardo Clement. He works for a German auto company, and he has dare I say, a kind of Jewish life. He changed his identity, he's a part of a minority, etc. And but the Germans know where he is, and the Mossad knows where he is, and etc. Eventually, they capture him, and Argentina is incensed that there is a foreign government, by the way, a newly formed foreign government, barely 48, 15 years old, who infringes on the sovereignty of Argentina. Who are they to bring spies and kidnap anybody and take him out in order to be judged, put in trial in Jerusalem, which is what Hannah Arendt will take. Hannah Arendt doesn't even think about the Buenos Aires side of the affair. But being a Latin American myself, and there are about 500,000 Latin American Jews today. The vast majority lives in Argentina, and the vast majority lives in Buenos Aires. The incursion of the Israeli government into Argentina to this day is an affront to left and right leaning governments. And one of the things that happened with the Jewish community immediately after the Eichmann kidnapping, when all the attention was already focused on what is Eichmann going to be declared, guilty or not guilty, is he going to be put to death, is that the Argentine Jewish community is incredibly vulnerable to anti-Semitic attacks because they are an extremity of the Israeli government for the first time in the southern sphere. So they create something that is called bitachon. It's a paramilitary organization that defends the Jewish community because the Argentine government will not defend it. I was part of bitachon in Mexico. It was a copycat effort in other Latin American communities, Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, of creating our own armies. Not waiting for the Israeli army to come and defend us, but creating, and guess what? Bitachon was advised by the Israeli army. And I remember going to many of these meetings and listening to heavy Hebrew accented Spanish, and also to somebody that sounded like an uncle of mine who had lived in Israel. By this, I want to tell you that this vulnerability and security of we are now at the disposal of, because we're a minority, it's not been quite so. There have been all kinds of strategies. We were trained with weapons. We were trained with having to go and cleanse some graffiti that was on walls. Sometimes a little bit more than that when a journalist was doing this or that. Not particularly a chapter in my life that I am proud of. And I have written about it. It's on Borrowed Words, if anybody wants to see it. It is a topic that now, for some of us Latin American Jewish scholars, is becoming more of a research topic. What happened to that paramilitary effort, and in what way did it represent who we are or not? Or was it only an extremity of the... But I think it's important to not think that only because we are in the diaspora, we have always been vulnerable and at the mercy of the elements. The Jewish communities have known very well how to organize. And after 1994, the biggest terrorist attack to a Latin American synagogue or Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, many Latin American communities are very well organized. There, I have spent 5 years traveling and talking to rabbis and activists, and I always walk with 2 or 3 guards that are members of the Jewish community. Some of them have been trained in Israel, others have been trained in Mexico or Cuba. Argentines have exported security to Mexican Jews or to Colombian Jews. So it's always a more complicated picture. So diasporism is not the innocent view of a we will be victims. And just my last point. To me, one of the best texts of diasporism and where I learned the most is Philip Roth's novel Operation Shylock. Did we read it in that course? You were absent those days.
Maybe we talked about it. You introduced me to it. I read it later.
Yeah.
I still don't understand why people love that book so much, and I like Philip Roth. But go on, sorry.
It's the story of Philip Roth finding out that there is a doppelganger in Israel called Philip Roth, who is plotting with the Polish government to repatriate some Israelis back to Poland because the Israeli experiment is a disaster. Poland is looking to move from socialism to capitalism. They need Jews as fast as possible. And so this doppelganger is, through diasporism, trying to lure some Israelis who long for the diaspora.
I should go reread it. We did read The Conversion of the Jews, which is a great story.
Yeah.
In that class. Okay, so I do think there are things we disagree about. Would be a little boring if it wasn't the case, right?
We don't want to.
Everything you said was interesting, and there's much that resonates with me. But so I would start by saying, I understand completely what you're saying about it being very hard to think about the Holocaust and Holocaust consciousness the same way going forward. I would say, and I think this will be a debate for scholars going forward, how to characterize the situation in Gaza. But however you characterize it, I think it is very far from Auschwitz, right? It's very far from the Shoah in terms of understanding the logics behind it, and that people can disagree, but I feel that that's important to recognize. I think that the challenges, I mean, Yossi Klein Halevi, who I disagree with as often as I agree with him, said something that I think was really important from pretty early in the war, which is his biggest critique of Israel's war effort was to not take seriously the responsibilities of Jewish power. To not, he was fairly defensive of the need for a brutal war, but he said, look, if we knew we had to wage this brutal war with new rules, we also needed to recognize that meant we were going to inflict tremendous humanitarian damage. We needed to set up some kind of humanitarian corridor. We needed to do much more to account for all of the suffering that would happen for civilians. We needed to be able to talk about it honestly, and that we failed in all those areas. And so I think part of thinking about the relationship between this moment and what remains, not only historically, but at present, in many places, and in some places increasing from October 7th, real Jewish vulnerability, to think about Jewish vulnerability while thinking about the realities of Jewish power in many cases and the responsibilities of Jewish power, right? And part of the polarity of Zionism and diasporism is that we often are much more comfortable thinking about some notion of Jewish vulnerability or even powerlessness, or which I think can be, and your point is very important, that Jews found ways in many diaspora settings to take care of themselves and organize themselves. But a certain kind of notion of Jewish powerlessness that for some is linked to what they regard as ethical superiority can be fetishized, just as Jewish power linked to Zionism or linked to a certain machismo or militarism can be fetishized. Both, I think, are unhealthy and intellectually inconsistent. But I don't think I don't think realistically in terms of where the Jewish community is at, Holocaust consciousness is going anywhere. I don't think that it should go anywhere, but I think thinking in more complicated ways about simultaneity of Jewish vulnerability and Jewish power in some ways is long overdue. I do want to talk for a minute about what you said about the intrinsic flaws of Zionism. So you said within the ideology of Zionism. So I don't really agree with either of those characterizations, and I'm going to be sort of an annoying historian. We have some disciplinary differences. I loved listening to you, by the way, talking about Eichmann in Argentina. I felt like I was back in your classroom, hearing something really provocative and interesting. So, look, I mean, I just think if we look historically at the range of Zionisms, and I don't mean just fringe people, I mean including a lot of important thinkers, I think it's overstating the case to say that the dehumanization of the rest of the population and the goal of their displacement is absolutely inherent to the ideology of Zionism. Clearly present for many people, clearly massive displacement and violence is an outcome, certainly since the Nakba of 1948, and people can make thoughtful, credible arguments about an inevitability at a certain point of that outcome with a nation-building movement. But even if we look at somebody like Jabotinsky, who I think is a profoundly misunderstood figure at this point, in the Iron Wall, he says right away, there is no question of expulsion. The last thing he writes in 1940, the Jewish War Front, he talks about having a Jewish prime minister and an Arab president, and how there are two nations in this land, and once the Arabs accept that we're here and we're not going anywhere, then we can have two nations living side by side. I don't want to, he says some other things that are not very friendly toward Arabs. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to idealize him, but the point is, I think it's too much to say that that's inherent in the ideology from the outset. And I also think that the notion that the arrival of Israel or the success of the Zionist project would have to mean the end of the diaspora, I also think that's too narrow. I mean, some of the early Zionists, to go back to the interconnectedness between notions of diasporism and notions of Zionism, some of them are very explicit that the reason Jews need, they're not even sure it's going to be a state, but some kind of a national foyer where they have autonomy is precisely so that Jews living elsewhere will have a certain kind of strength, they say. Pinsker says basically what Jews are missing is the credibility of having a nation state, right? And that this is why anti-Semitism is going to persist until that happens. And I want to just mention, in relation to things like the story of the Bitachon that you told, which is very interesting, and I know other stories, I didn't know that one. There's an argument, and I think it's a credible and an important argument, that the existence of Israel and the strength of Israel has made it more possible for Jews in many places to feel that they could create militias, create defense forces, that with a certain level of greater confidence or pride than they would have had in the absence of a Jewish state. It's a counterfactual question, so it's hard to measure, and of course it's not the case that there were no such militias that ever existed in the period before Zionism, but people are often explicitly connecting what they're doing. They are often working with members of the Mossad or the Israeli government. That's the case in Algeria in the 1950s, for instance, a case much closer to my own research. I do think we shouldn't completely lose sight of that in thinking about the capacity of Jews to stand up in certain ways in certain diaspora contexts. I think for now I'll stop there.
So I'm conscious of the time. There are classes that start at 12:30, and so
including one I teach.
Yes, including one that you teach. So I want to give the audience some time to respond. I want to say how much I appreciate the work that you both have done in conversation to give us a sense of elasticity and that it's possible to talk about these things and bring so many different perspectives together. If I have a sort of ideal moderator in mind who could bring all of these threads together into a beautiful tapestry to present. But she's not at the table today. So instead, with all these nice threads that have been laid out, I will turn it over to the audience to see if there are questions, comments. Jackson.
Good morning. My name is Jackson. I promised this question I'd give a question mark. I feel like much of early and even current state Zionism often does feel disparaging of diasporism. I think of early Zionist posters with very strapping masculine men, kind of at the expense of Jewish men in the diaspora. I think of the Diaspora Museum in Israel using all black and white photos and painting a very non-joyous view of the diaspora experience. I was wondering, how has the diaspora how has diasporism responded to that? And how has maybe, since October 7th, how has state Zionism responded to maybe some of those critiques now that we've seen Jews in Israel being so much more vulnerable?
Did that mean repeat the question?
Yeah, I think. Do you want to repeat
No,
the question?
do go
Okay,
ahead.
so for the recording, for the microphone, Jackson's question is reminding us that there have been very disparaging representations of diasporism from state Zionism, and reminding us of posters, exhibits where Jews who live in Israel are portrayed as healthy and strapping, and Jews outside of Israel as not. So the question has to do with that perspective on the history of how Zionism has related to diasporism.
Yes, Jackson. It's absolutely the case. There is a representation of the hunchback, long-nosed, and I have evidence working together with the Yiddish Book Center, a Jew in the diaspora as an icon in the early posters of Zionism, of we are finally standing up. We're men again. We're not effeminated with the body disfigurement. We are connected with the outdoors, with the light. We are not money lenders. We are not, I was talking about the journey that I've done in 5 years. It was for a book called The Seventh Heaven, Travels Through Jewish Latin America. And at the very end of the very beginning of that book is a dream that I have after reading Ansky, as in the D books, Ansky, a book about the destruction of Galicia, not Spain, but Galicia, Poland, depending on the time. And the book ends with a visit to Bet Futsot in Israel, the Museum of the Diasporas, which at the outset is a misnomer because it's kind of a journey that you take through the different synagogues in order to see how the Israelis architecture is going to be built and how you are going to be seeing the different episodes in life in order to come to the messianic conclusion that Israel is now going to solve all this. But of course, where else are you going to put a museum of the diaspora? Well, there's a Jewish museum in Paris and there's a Jewish museum in Buenos Aires and there are Holocaust museums here and there. And then the role of memory and the role of turning a particular location into a site where we immortalize a vision. But, and again, with the role of Yiddish, Yiddish was the language of women, of language that wasn't legitimate. Ben-Gurion forbid Yiddish because he wanted Hebrew to be, and I can understand, there's a force to create a nation here, but it came at the expense of the complexity of the diaspora with some imagery that is not too far from the anti-Semitic iconography that we have in the 19th century in Germany or in Russia, etc. So it's a triumphalist vision of Jewish history that culminates in the creation of a Jewish state. When the Naturei Karta, for instance, and other Orthodox, some of the Satmar Hasidim have been against Zionism. I'm not presenting diasporism as a negation of Zionism. I myself am ambivalent of where I am, and I thrive in ambivalence. But I believe that there is a much more complex history of Zionism, and post-Zionist ideology is a desire to see Zionism in a more complex way within Israel. So it's not as if I'm saying something new. Israel has been into a soul-searching, reckoning period. I don't think, Ethan, that we can compare Gaza with Auschwitz, but we don't need to compare it to think that both of them are atrocious.
We can agree on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. No, I mean, I was just going to say in terms of because you also asked a question, right, about post-October 7th diaspora, Israel relations changing. I think ultimately it has become and will be regarded as a moment of tremendous strain and fracture. There was a moment in the weeks and months after October 7th of tremendous solidarity among a really wide spectrum of Jews in the diaspora. But as the war ground on, as there were more and more really difficult to take images and reports from Gaza, as moments that looked like they might wind the war down passed, as opportunities were missed, as opportunities were sabotaged in some cases by the far-right forces in the Israeli government, it became harder and harder for many people to be comfortable with what Israel was doing or to not become fiercely critical. And in some cases, people were really on the front lines as Jews critical of the war. And at the same time, there was not only a rise of criticism, but a rise of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism that often was really inflicting harm on Jews in particularly parts of this country, which together those things made those people continuing to defend Israel much more defensive. So, and I think that split has basically only continued to get more extreme. We can even see it in recent weeks. And so the more that many Jews, including many of us who have long considered ourselves liberal Zionists, find what Israel is doing unpalatable, the more that even forms of loving critique are being savaged by the more right-wing defenders of Israel. And I don't know how long lasting the damage will be in terms of Jewish community and the divisions that are emerging, but it's very stark.
Yes.
I recently heard of this term, Doikite, I think it's called.
Yes.
That was one of mine. And I would love to hear you both talk about that concept.
I don't.
Say the term again.
It's a Bundist.
It's a Buddhist term.
It's D-O-I-K-A-Y-T, I believe.
Oh, like here-ness?
Here-ness.
Here-ness,
Yeah.
right.
It's related, I think.
To hear it is?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
this idea that we can build. And it's being
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
I haven't heard that, but this is an invitation for me to now go and hear it and sense it in different places. I also want to be careful in not romanticizing the diaspora. I don't think we have been romanticizing the diaspora, but there's no way to romanticize the diaspora. From Khmelnytsky to Hitler, the diaspora has its gallery of ogres. And yes, suffering might build character, but we don't want more suffering. And I also think that October 7 is not only a benchmark in the history of Zionism, it's a benchmark in the history of the Jewish people in the diaspora too. Not as a triumphalist moment against Zionism, but it's another moment of Khurban, of destruction, that proves this vulnerability. And clearly not answering your question, I would have never imagined at your age or at the age of the first question person, that in my older age, the three Jewish leaders in the world would be Netanyahu, a right-winger in Israel, Zelensky, the one who is leading Europe against Russia, a Jew in one of the most anti-Semitic countries where my ancestors were aborted from, and Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, the daughter of Sephardic and Ashkenazi, a scientist, absolutely a left-winger, anti-Semitism in Mexico and in Nicaragua and in Honduras and in Colombia is very high, and she is straddling many different moments of how to quiet this fire, or how to put down this fire. But look at this gallery of individuals. I don't think Philip Roth could have invented that. Certainly not about Mexico. A country never crossed his mind in any way.
I'm not an expert on Buddhism, but the question about Doikite, I think, is important. I think it points to the fact that there is this renewed interest in diasporism. I think we've had a little slippage in our conversation between the condition of living in the diaspora and preferring the diaspora and having a sort of a really kind of robust ideology or set of practices.
Yeah, because diasporism is an ideology.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Diaspora and diasporism are two different things.
Right. So to the degree that, if we are in a new age of renewed debates around Jewish peoplehood and Jewish politics, and diasporism is emerging on the table in a new way, and some people point to Doikite, but I think the question is really about people needing in a sense to revive a set of traditions. I think that they're there in Buddhism. I still think Shimon Dubnov had in some ways a more substantial program, and if you really want to think about you really want to think about, people want to propose either, radically altered political order in Israel-Palestine plus, or they want to think about alternative ways of thinking about Jewish peoplehood to Zionism as it's known today, then I think you have to think also about institutions. I mean, I will just say, part of this conversation is also about a level of comfort or discomfort with Jewish power. As you said, we don't want to romanticize the diaspora. There are many places where, despite Jews' best efforts, their power was extremely limited, and they were persecuted and had very little ability to defend themselves. And I would say, if you want to talk about diasporism and you really want to talk about it as an alternative, viable form of Jewish politics and peoplehood to Zionism, I don't think we're there, because I think right now it's being conceived largely sort of in anti-Zionist terms, and it's being conceived generally by people who are profoundly uncomfortable with any idea of Jewish power. And I understand that discomfort, but we live in a world of nation states. Whether or not the nation state is one of the sillier ideas mankind ever came up with, and you can argue that it is still the coin of the realm. It's the way that polities are organized, and it's the way that political institutions are organized. And therefore, if you're going to propose an alternative to that's why I think going back to Dubnov in some ways is really generative, because he actually talked a lot about institution building around some notion of a diaspora nationalism.
Sarah.
To add to the diaspora, it is a comment, but just because the Museum of the Diaspora responded to criticism when they actually changed their name to Museum of the Jewish People. And supposedly you changed even exhibits. That I don't know about. But they did self-consciously get the criticism. So interesting. But, and then my question is personal, and if it's too personal, don't answer. But I was curious what you did with your boys.
What did I do with my voice?
Yeah,
Ask me what they did with me. That's tougher.
No, when you wanted them to experience
anti-Semitism. I sent them to Amherst schools. I tried to, one thing that I consciously did is that they went for entire summers to Mexico and spend it with their grandparents. And they both remember that very fondly, but also as a wake-up call of what they didn't have in the United States. And it came with other things that were part of their education. Very quickly, both of them went to Israel for a while. One of them can't even pronounce the word Israel, and the other one is much more measured. And so that's why I was telling you, I'd ask them what they have done to me, because I feel divided between the two.
Well, you gave them options.
Yeah.
It is ambivalent.
Ambivalence, yeah. But diaspora to me has always been about ambivalence, about not being in one side and going to the other. And I know that you're talking about nation state and the institutions, and I'm talking more about kind of a sensibility of the diaspora. And the sensibility of the diaspora, for me, is the sensibility of navigating in choosing temporary answers to different moments or different questions that come up.
Yeah, Roni.
Can I just respond to that and say that you've been gravitating, the three of you, towards the plasticity and the flexibility, which makes sense with the conceptualization of diaspora, but it does not with Zionism.
Yeah.
Or contemporary Israeli discourse. The Israeli project has always been an elimination of the diaspora. And when the moments that they felt, like the diaspora was something was mostly to appease the mind of wealthy American Jews. That's evident. I'm now speaking to the historian in the Blaustein-Ben-Gurion exchange. Culturally, politically, in terms of language, of culture building, many of the things that Ilan has mentioned. So there is a tension here between the plasticity and the fact that there is a very clear articulation of direct conflict in Zionist discourse from the turn of the 19th century and until today, with a clear desire to eliminate the diaspora.
Yeah.
To eliminate.
the diaspora.
Oh.
I'll give you one good example. There's a saying in the Midrash, "Atidei Eretz Yisrael shetitpashet b'chol ha'aratzot," that in the days to come, the land of Israel will spread all throughout, will expand and will spread throughout the world and throughout the generations. Rabbis have understood it as saying that the geographic boundaries don't mean anything. What's meaningful is a certain kind of the holiness, and that holiness will spread throughout the world in the days to come. And then these Yiddishist diasporas, of course, pick up this sentence in the interwar period when they say every place in the world is a piece of the land of Israel. But just a few months ago, I heard Smotrich, the member of parliament, saying that exact same phrase, that the land of Israel is bound to spread throughout the world, but he meant it, of course, in the sense of military expansionism, right? And imperialist, that the land of Israel will actually take over the entire world in very concrete ways.
Yeah.
So there's a strong, I mean, the two ideas are in direct conflict. While I'm saying that, while being sympathetic to the ambivalence,
Yeah.
as a thoroughly ambivalent person.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would just, I mean, I think it's, I mean, Smotrich coming to power already, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir joining a government well before October 7th was a watershed moment in Israeli politics in the worst possible way. And they've exercised extraordinary power in this moment in my view, extraordinarily destructive ways for the state and for Zionism. Having said all of that, while he doesn't represent a tiny minority, he does represent a minority. He's not supported by a majority of the Israeli public. His ideology is, so I just think it's important to recognize in terms of Zionism. But I take your point, Voni. I mean, again, I'm going to be a little bit of an annoying historian. I mean, I wouldn't say that, like, I think it's too much to say that for the last 120 some years, it's always been the case that all Zionists, or the vast majority of Zionists, have regarded the elimination of the diaspora Jew as sort of the obvious important endpoint. I mean, there was a period, it was the period that I sort of grew up in, I think, where the two centers of America and Israel was seen as a relatively kind of settled question, and that there was a lot of discussion.
On the American side, not on the Israeli side.
I
Being the annoying Israeli.
Yes, okay. I appreciate that. Always about you. No, but yes, it's true that it was seen in a much more favorable way by Americans, but there was also a move towards saying we need to think more about this relationship. There were Israelis who said, Israel gets a lot from American Jews. We need to figure out how to stop thinking about it as a one-way relationship. I think that may be, now a thing of the past. But that's simply to say, I mean, there is actually a whole notion called diaspora Zionism, right? The idea that you're not planning to move, but you embrace the importance of the Jewish state. You would have bought Israel bonds if you were a diaspora Zionist in the 50s. I think that the period where two states seemed most viable was also the period where multiple Jewish centers seemed most viable to a significant portion of world Jewry. And I have to say, I have a memory from your class, actually, and I guess this was in the spring of 2002. And so we were in the Second Intifada, and there were some, anti-Semitic type of things that even happened maybe on our campus, people were hearing about. And Adam Rothman, who would later become a rabbi, said, I wonder if we're going to look back and feel like the 1990s were this golden age period, and that actually now we're back in a harder period of Jewish history that is more normative. I was rather dismissive to myself, thinking, in response to that at the time. I was totally, oblivious to the reality that was coming. So anyway, but I think that to the extent that there was a period where there was, more a kind of confidence of a post-Zionism, almost post-anti-Semitism for American Jews, that was probably the period where there was the most comfort on each side with sort of multiple Jewish centers.
Yes, and I'm going to say that you, as the guest of honor, will have the last word. So
and I'll say it very quickly.
It.
At the very same time when the Shlichim started coming to Mexico to replace the Yiddish teachers, it was when Israel, we heard, was selling weapons to Nicaragua. And so it's two things that for many of us Latin American Jews were being exported to Latin America, which is never the United States with all the money. It was the weapons on the one hand, and with the Iran-Contra affair, with the dirty war, that was a crucial moment. And the message, a little bit like the Spaniards during the colonial period, is you have the Bible on the one hand, the education, and then you have the powder and the weapon on the other hand, and you show them to the natives. And the last part, very quickly, still, is that I remember when I was in my late 20s thinking that Gershom Scholem and Hannah Arendt and Walter Benjamin had really been tested. They were of a generation that had all the confluences on them, and that I knew that we would not be tested again because that was the last Jewish generation that faced those challenges. And if anything, I appreciate enormously the civility and the fact that this meeting has not been interrupted, and that we've been able to discuss a topic that might make us disagree and might make us also uncomfortable. And also that no matter how old we are, I think it's this generation that will figure out, or the next 10 years or 20 years, that will figure out whatever the next chapter is in both the multi-chapter narrative that is the history of the Jewish people. And I think that this even-handed, hopefully enlightening conversations are a step forward, is precisely because there's disagreement to where we're going. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, everybody.
Lovely.